This is your host of CivilNet, Eric Hacopian, and we are honored to have as our guest today for our year-end special, Professor Georgi Derluguian. He doesn't need any introduction, but I just wanted to say that today's interview is more like a conversation and a sort of a year-end special to talk about the broader issues facing this country and the Armenians in general. It's a pleasure to have you on our show, Professor Derluguian. I'm going to ask you one of my favorite lines over the years is from the Italian theoretician Antonio Gramsci. And he speaks of this concept of the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. And obviously he was talking about the ideological battles of the 20th century, which are not particularly relevant to us. But as far as a principle in how you approach life, you could sort of, his concept, despite he was a 20th century man, this is almost like a Roman concept, amor fati, you love your faith, you don't question where you're at. You don't sit and wail about why are we not between Uruguay and Austria rather than the location that we're in. You sort of accept your faith and you embrace your faith. And the way I see this is you sort of ground yourself in the reality. And reality is always more pessimistic than optimistic, just because there's more challenges than there are opportunities, in most instances. While at the same time, sort of intellectually embracing this notion that we have agency, both as a people and a culture, and as individuals. And not only can we solve our problems, in fact, in certain cases, we can impose our will on our problems. How do you see this statement, this line from him, in the context that's useful to us, given where we're at as a culture and a country?
Oh, dear Eric, you speak much more like a professor than I am. Human agency and will. Look, first of all, fortunately, we are nowhere in such a desperate position as Gramsci was himself. To remind you, he was in prison. He was in a fascist prison in Italy, with terrible headaches, banging his head on the wall, where he ultimately dies. And he was writing on scraps of paper, which fortunately his Russian sister-in-law, when she received the body, this is the worst telling, she received the body in the prison after his death. There were the scraps of paper stuck everywhere underneath his undershirt. And in the 1950s, this was put together and called the prison notebooks of Antonio Gramsci. He won. Actually, if you look at Italy, so Mussolini did not last, but he became a martyr of the communist movement, and he was the shining star theoretician of democracy and historical progress for West European communists, for the Euro-communists, as they were called in the 1960s, 1970s. And in that respect, in the 20th century, he was triumphant in the second half of it, because he felt, that one of the historical possibilities was that it's so grim, but it could not last. So we are, first of all, in Armenia, not in such a desperate position. Well, okay, look, we have light. There is food. And the problem is mostly in human heads. Now, it's a difficult situation. However, to remind you, that our conversations, much earlier while the war was still raging, there were three possibilities, as I outlined. So there was one possibility that Turkey and Azerbaijan win outright. Artsakh would be destroyed. Artsakh actually had very little chance. We knew that. It was quite obvious, all along, that once a much bigger and better organized army, far better financed, attacks the static positions, and Armenians were occupying quite impossible positions around Artsakh. Why? Because they had to dig those trenches in presumably defensible position, but they never had enough manpower for such a big battlefront, to man all those trenches for decades. They were like sitting ducks there, excuse me, because you could not abandon an inch of those positions because it would be considered a catastrophe by the nation. So you could not either counterattack, abandon the trenches and move ahead. And with every year it was becoming more and more impossible militarily. Simply, as the other side, was pumping more and more money into buying hardware. And they were receiving, to remind you, very serious foreign aid, not only Turkish, as you realize. There were Israeli drones. They were shopping around everywhere, from Belarus to Kazakhstan, because they could. It's a very cynical trade. On the other hand, Armenians could not withdraw from their position because that would be betrayal of the national cause. And that's why they were sitting there as targets for years. So there was a possibility, of course, of Artsakh being completely demolished. There was a remote possibility of showing great combat spirit, holding on to your positions, and what many Armenians hoped, against all hope, that even moving further ahead and solving militarily, the problem, gaining the recognition of Artsakh through another victory, which I don't think was probable. Many military experts, both Western and Russian, were saying that, guys, it's a very improbable proposition. So if you put too much of your faith into something which is not very probable, you're going to suffer very bitter disillusionment. And then there was something in the middle. And that in the middle would be an international protectorate over Artsakh. And this is what actually happened. So I would suggest pay attention not only to the woes of Armenia right now, but the fact which is there, and so look at this as a game board. So what is the end of this war? That Azerbaijan gained the 7 districts that even Armenians recognized, had belonged to Azerbaijan. Right? They were holding those 7 districts as bargaining chip. Mm-hmm. That did not work, but Artsakh is still there. So pay attention to the latest 2 pieces of news. For instance, one is that Russians are opening up the airport in Stepanakert. So something which was not possible, militarily not possible, and politically not possible for years, is suddenly happening. So I have a very simple question to which nobody could answer yet, even among the journalists. Which airline is going to make the flights? Is it going to be most likely some kind of Russian airline? How often? And who are going to be the border guards? Are they going to be Russian border guards in the airport? And on what passports actually people will travel? On the passports of Mountainous Karabakh Republic? Most likely, because that's what they have. Which means that Artsakh actually continues to exist. President Eric Hacopian has just made several changes in his government. Yeah. So these might sound as usual Armenian moves, so remove someone, promote someone else. However, he has that power. He's still removing it. So Artsakh is there, and even the defense forces of Artsakh are still there. I don't know how long can they last without supplies, because now there is only one supply route. So this is a question. However, Artsakh is not finished. Second, the news from London, actually, if you paid attention, I think, was it yesterday, that the wife of the president of Azerbaijan's International Bank lost the final appeal in British courts, and so her splendid flat in London is going to be confiscated because she could not provide any plausible explanation regarding the origin of those millions of pounds. This is the first time that this new legislation and this new law in
the
UK,
recent one,
it's recent, but this is precedent setting. And it's a very troubling precedent, probably, of course, not only to Azerbaijan. Mm-hmm. To many other countries from where looted wealth was taken and parked somewhere in the UK, that slowly, as we know, scandals grow up slowly in the West. But there is something inexorable about it. So it reaches a point when it becomes actually difficult to run to the West. Where do you run? Where do you park your stolen money? And then add to this, all these revelations from The Guardian about the Azerbaijani funds discovered in the UK. They were paying, for private boarding schools for their children, as well as apparently bribes to European Union officials for the trips and so forth. All that is becoming more problematic. So life has not stopped. And what troubles me here is that people in Armenia, including the opinion makers, are paying very little attention. I don't see good analysis of what is going on.
I think, well, one of the things that's very consistent here is, even from very smart people, is parochialism. Our worlds are very limited, and this doesn't just, it's not just about Armenians in Armenia, it's about Armenians worldwide. And Armenian diaspora is frankly even, in some ways, even more, despite the fact that they're in the middle of the world, they actually pay less attention to or don't have a complete understanding of the context of the world that they live in and the opportunities that that world offers. My second question for you is, and I've noticed this, and it's troubled me, is it's very clear that we do not have a cultural responsibility in this country. And what I mean by that is we've been through this catastrophic war in which, yes, the odds were against us, but obviously we made tremendous mistakes. We had tremendous shortcomings that a better state would not have. A better run country over the last 25 years would have had a better opportunity to defend itself better, maybe not win, but have better outcomes. And what we do not, and what we don't see is any the old regime, there's no characters there saying, I'm in any way responsible for this. The current government, Pashinyan, has made some noises about responsibility, but he quickly turns around and blames other people as he says, I'm responsible, but I'm not totally responsible. The military, no responsibility whatsoever. There's a complete lack of this taking account of looking at yourself before you look at other people. One of the things that I've come to the conclusion is that the revolution sort of got rid of this culture of impunity. You can't get away with things that people use. There's no bodyguards going around beating people to death or things like that, which is no small accomplishment. It actually is something significant. But this lack of complete, this lack of cultural responsibility, where does this come from? Is this Soviet? Is this the whole sort of this post-Soviet lack of quality people in leadership, or is it a third world condition, or is it just human nature? What's the source of this lack of responsibility?
Well, the question about human nature is to psychologists, but I think you pointed to it. So it's very much like all these litanies about corruption. That the post-communist corruptions. So my prank I used to play on my colleagues at World Bank every time they would start again on something. Armenia is too corrupt to have an economic reform. And say, yeah. Coming from Chicago, where we have the mayor who had been elected with 89% of the vote, 5 times in a row, being the son of the previous mayor of Chicago, and they would turn pale. Yeah, so this is pretty much universal. What you call taking responsibility, it has something to do with religion, especially with Christianity. Of course, you have to confess your sins. However, it also has to do much more directly, with the modern cultures of political accountability, and very few countries actually could ever develop that. One of the conditions of one of the key conditions actually is the existence of the default position for the opposition. Where do the former ruling party retire, after they lose politically, election or a war like here? Is there a possibility to become a senior statesman in any of these post-Soviet republics?
Usually exile.
Exactly, so this is what in political science they call the 1.5 party system. One party is in power, the other is in jail. very few formerly ruling parties in the former Soviet republics were able to continue exist actually. So one example is next door in Georgia, where Saakashvili's former party is still trying, to stage a comeback. I think it's actually quite encouraging that the former party of Serge Sargsyan, the so-called Republican Party of Armenia, they still exist. I'm not sure to what extent, but they are not massacred, they are not exiled, they are not imprisoned, and they're trying to make a comeback, right? So there is something there already. But the most important thing, what is missing, and I think you pointed to it yourself in your previous interviews when you were being interviewed, that a smart opposition would offer a golden bridge to Nikol Pashinyan to get rid of him. They would show, what he could do, rather than promising, to chop off his head. Which is literally, so you hear things, that people want executions from this. So I think we have to bring more public pressure, both public pressure here, we have to mobilize it, because I feel that it is out there in a very diffuse form, that people are very displeased with both current power and all the previous iterations of power. So it's very important to mobilize this opinion. It's very important to mobilize the opinion of diaspora. Guys, you have to put your act together. Because, and here we're coming to the biggest problem, right? You cannot do much if you don't have an accountable, nimble, smaller government apparatus. So right now, we have an overbloated. Why is it overbloated? Because that's job creation, cheap job creation. This is a legacy of the 1990s. We also have to realize, that the so-called independence, or the second independence of Armenia, was actually the result of catastrophe, because collapse of the Soviet Union. And my colleague at Princeton, Stephen Kotkin, at the time invented a very damning label for this, the emergence of trashcanistans. So all these new stands that looked very much like trash cans, because they were relics of something which was already decrepit itself, and then they collapsed. So what do we do? So this is back to Gramsci, so this is the situation we are. This is the game board that we have. Are there moves? And I dare you see the moves. There are possible moves. We actually know what to do. It's possible, to rehold the whole game, but we're not even talking about it.
Yeah, no, I think this is, well, part of it is to expand the concept of what constitutes, and I'm talking to exceptionally intelligent people here, and there's a lack of imagination as far as what constitutes politics, because politics here is limited to personalities, politicians, and elections. Well, in fact, what you need is a public citizen that is engaged all the time. More importantly, demanding things, demanding changes, demanding specific things, which is something that we've never seen. And if we can come anywhere close to developing any of that in this process, it'd be a humongous win. That's to the extent that the political class feels that they need to be responsive to people. Another key thing that I want to move to is one of the risks of losing a war, like we have lost, there's two ways. There's essentially two variances. One is you sort of sit back, learn your lessons, and improve, and sort of, take responsibility for your failures. And the other one is to become what I call a defeated nation, which sort of poisons your body politic, and it prevents you from moving forward. In the United States, for years, they had this thing called the Vietnam syndrome. And I remember right after the Gulf War, the Bush the elder said, we kicked the Vietnam syndrome in the whatever, which was sort of a silly statement. And you can look at our neighbor in Azerbaijan. There's a fairly decent case to be made that the post-defeat era in the First Karabakh War literally poisoned not only their cultural and political atmosphere, but their development, in the sense that you become obsessed with something at the expense of everything else, and it sort of warps your development. At this moment, how do we not become a defeated nation and look at more introspection and changes rather than blame and getting into this trauma?
Social change in general is like a process of crystallization. So you drop something in the environment and crystals begin, if the environment is thick enough. And I think it is very thick in at least two possibilities in Armenia. One is terrifying. This general mood that, look, that guy is leaving. There are so many mothers with 15-year-old sons who are thinking about leaving because they don't want, 3 years from now to entrust their children to inept military commanders, for another defeat. And when you see around yourself, enough people talking about moving away somewhere, so I cannot fix the country, therefore I'm going to fix my own fate. At least I hope so. I'm going to wash cars in Glendale. I'm going to wait tables. So sometimes I hear this from the people, I cannot believe my ears. Look, you are a banker here or something. I'm going to wait tables. No, you are not. You really don't understand what it means, to live at $15,000 a year. But there is this mood, and that's one point of crystallization. And why is it dangerous? Because yes, the population of the country is significantly less than 3 million people. We know that the demographic losses have been huge over the past couple decades. And if this goes in the same direction further, well, there will be nobody left to switch off the lights in the country. The country will disappear. It's small enough. It can disappear, literally. Very few people so far admit, so they admit defeat, they admit how bad things are. Look another 20 years into the future, and you can see an abyss. And that will not happen all of a sudden. Like famous American sociologist Wright Mills said that historical change happens very, very slowly, and then all of a sudden. So it will be slowly hemorrhaging people, and the best, most important people in this country. And then, halas, it will disappear. There is another, however, possibility, and that's where I'm much more hopeful, because there are quite a few people who tell me, now it sounds like defiance of the will. I'm staying, professor, but we are staying here. Yesterday I had a conversation. There are many people in doubt. I had a conversation yesterday with one of my builders. So in Armenia, so we're always doing, remont, we're always building somewhere. So he had doubts that so many of my clients are leaving the country. What should I do? I said, well, what is your prospect? How many languages do you speak to begin with? Stay. I'm paying. There are other people who will be doing construction, and we must convince a sufficient number, and then there will be this crystallization or snowballing effect, that you can rebuild the country. But for that, there is one crucial condition, very difficult to accomplish. The rest would be much easier, and this is a different governance apparatus. So there has to be a different state here. This takes political will. This takes a cadre, but I see that cadre of people, both locally, those younger than 30, and probably repatriating, because there are not very many instances in the world where you can rebuild a country. There is glory in that. And besides, just comfortable living in Armenia. It's a great place, So I think, if somebody can start the process, there will be more crystallization in the opposite direction. And then 5 years from now, Armenia will look different. 20 years from now, it will be a very different country. Why I'm relatively optimistic about it? Because other former Trashkanistans have been also moving in more or less in that direction. So we see that there are disasters. Ukraine is a disaster. And by the way, so it's very important for Armenians to study other former Soviet republics. How many people can I know two, at least in Yerevan, who can discuss the politics of Kyrgyzstan. Many people would fret at this idea. So why do we need Kyrgyzstan? Because this is a parallel development. Not exactly like in Armenia, but you must know what is happening in Georgia. And above all, of course, you have to have a cadre of people who can discuss Azerbaijan and what happened there. Which we don't. So we have to train actually our new cadre. So what I described to you, it's not just a kind of public issue. This is part of the program that we will need for probably 2-year training of these new cadres in the government. To explain to them, this is really what happened in Bulgaria. This is what are the problems in Moldova and how are they dealing, and different forces in Moldova. This is what provides for the difference between Ukraine and Belarus. And Belarus is one of the actually shining examples. So once you remove Lukashenko there, and he will be removed, so there is hardly anyone better suited, to join the European Union, for instance. They're up to all those standards. And now they have shown what kind of society they have as well. Of course, the biggest issue will be Russia. And again, I don't see enough Russia watchers here. This is amazing. There are supplicants. There are people who hope to find ways once again in Moscow. So one lobbying group or another lobbying group. But you have to study. Whom do you lobby with? What are the problems of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin? And he does have problems. And those problems are actually our problems because we're now a military protectorate.
One of the things that was obviously during the war and after the war, we saw this systematic barbarism and brutality against civilians in Artsakh and our POWs. And I've always been perplexed by this question: how much of this is the horrors of war, which happen in every war, and how much of this brutality was in fact intended state terror to have specific purposes and to reach specific goals? Which one do you see? And we've seen the images, we've seen the videos. Which one do you think it is, or is it a combination of the two?
I would be very cautious in discussing such things. So on the one hand, going back to Sumgait pogrom elsewhere, so we see that Azerbaijani society, which is very largely a former rural society, very recently rural society. The best measure is simply, the birth rates. So this is third world, right? People moving into big cities. By the way, this is exactly what brought this wave of villagers moving into very uncomfortable suburbs. Americans call them inner cities, but in a place like Istanbul, that would be newly built suburbs. This is the wave that brought Erdogan to power as well. That swept away the former Kemalist elite. Something like that happened in Azerbaijan in the 1990s. So you have to realize, that there is a new nation. It is a new nation. And this is not to say that, hey, Armenians are ancient and no, Armenians are also not quite ancient, so we can, we are built from some ancient blocks, but this is a new construction. In Azerbaijan, however, they lacked even those blocks very often. For instance, like it or not, but in majority of countries, historical religion serves the foundation of national identity. I would mean even France, for instance, that it's Catholicism, yeah. Like it or not, and then of course, Jacobinism, which is the refutation of Catholicism, which is the French republicanism, something like that. In Azerbaijan, religion cannot serve the foundation. However, there is a big imprint. The population is, of course, formerly Islamic. So I think this is the best definition of it. It's formerly Islamic. The practices were very much down through the Soviet period. So this is the most westernized. Let me remind you, Azerbaijan is part of the Muslim world that had been under Russian domination for 2 centuries. That's the longest occupation of any Islamic territory in modern history. And that was profoundly transformative, not only because these were Russians, kind of settler variety of colonialism, but also because of oil in Baku, because that created a very multi-ethnic hub. Then all those ethnic groups, not only Armenians, were expelled or left in the 1990s. For the first time ever, and I claim it is ever, in history, Baku becomes almost mono-ethnic, and people move from villages, and they move amidst all this post-Soviet ruin. Huge disparity between rich and poor. There, it's very difficult to trust the official statistics, but all the indicators are that Azerbaijani elite did not really share, could not probably share the oil wealth very well. The state really consists of sinecure, so you get this or that, for loyalty to the ruling family. It's a very familial state. So if you don't belong to the ruling families, you're very much damned. And then, what remains of your identity? So you really cannot claim that you are Shia Muslim because then you're part of Iran. Are you Turk? But you actually speak, of course, there are all these claims, that it's the same language, but it's not exactly the same language. Not only because the Turks have reformed in the 1930s, very thoroughly their language, purging it of Arabic and Persian, making it much more national. But also because the Azerbaijani accent is very much a village accent to the Turks. You're really lesser brother, you're a rural brother. So what are you? So the whole world thinks that you are just bazaris, somewhere in Russia, and the smart Armenians are everywhere. Why you wouldn't hate them? And they win wars. So I don't think, that brutality was very much directed, but at the same time, I don't see how Azerbaijani government or whatever is there of the command structure could have prevented it. So they probably gave a go-ahead, attack those, as long as you're fighting, try to capture something, go ahead. And this is what in sociology we call forward panic. You hate and fear and loathe the other side. So when you capture someone from and you see, that they are, prisoners are weak, they're exposed, so you can expect brutalities. Otherwise, I urge caution. I want to see more data. I want it much more systematic. I don't really see much extraordinary. In fact, look at the whole discussion about the Christian churches being in the areas being occupied. Dadivank is the biggest example. That there were attempts from Azerbaijani side to punish some of the people who were probably unlucky. They were singled out for some of the most egregious acts. Why? Because there was Russian pressure, most obviously. So the way to deal with that is to create more pressure.
A public campaign.
Public campaign, yes. And I think it will work, because I don't see anything particularly sinister there. So this is, unfortunately, within the param. Look at the war in Chechnya. Look what happened in Abkhazia, in other wars in the region. So unfortunately, this is not outside the general picture.
One thing that has struck me, you read so much from criticisms from inside of Armenia and from outside of Armenia. And one of the things that has really struck me is how little thinking there is out there, and how few new ideas, if anything, exists, either in the diaspora or here. I think it's fair to say that our diaspora is somewhat stuck in the 19th century when it comes to its view of the world. Looking at our political organizations, or the parties, or even their structures are 19th century. And Armenia itself is stuck sort of in the 20th century, where you're a Soviet republic, where your foreign policy and military issues get taken care of by Moscow. You don't even think about what part of the world you're in and what advantages you can take. And you have this situation, And one of the things that struck me, which was amazing to me, that sort of crystallizes, there was a prominent Armenian organization who wrote a letter for the prime minister to resign, and in the letter, the organization asks for a prominent place for the church and the reform of the country. You would think that they want to create, I mean, what are we, the Christian Iran? I mean, it is, the church plays such a, beyond symbolism, such a small role in the lives of ordinary people on a daily basis here. It tells you how clueless and out of touch they are. Why do we have a case of so much individual brilliance as a culture and innovation? And we can go through all the names, and such dearth of any thinking outside these old romanticized notions of the 19th, 20th century, which are irrelevant today. What explains this contradiction?
Oh, the great sociologist Max Weber had in his, that he was primarily interested in religion. Remember, Protestant ethic. Had a very important distinction between church and sect. Sect is oriented all inside, very intense feelings, that we are this and the rest of the world is not like that, and so we must keep together, forever. So there are Armenian national sects, especially in diaspora, for obvious reason, because people have actually a choice when they're in diaspora. It's self-selection. What do you do on Sunday? So do you participate in some Armenian activities? And those activities, you're right, very uninventive, very standard. My son, who just happens to live in Glendale, California, because it was a good rent, because he's a filmmaker, but he always complains, that Dad, I get all these invitations because they find from Armenian groups, because they find my Armenian-sounding name, and again, his story. Well, it's genetically speaking, we're not quite Armenian. My mother is Cossack, my grandmother was Cossack. So I have no choice. I have no control over the marriage choices of my father, grandfather, and so forth. But I asked my son, so why don't you? Well, Dad, so it's either, they get together and cook dolma, or they parade in big black cars, honk, and wave Armenian flags. It's boring. So there is that part, where you don't have to make much effort because you're part of the sect. And if you're part of the sect, you just wave flags and honk and eat dolma. But then, there are other kinds of Armenians, and that's a problem actually, potentially, because they leave the sect and join the bigger world. Why? Because this is where their careers are.
Well, the sect is too limited.
Mm-hmm. And so they become something else. They kind of, potential Armenians, but their careers, their audiences are out there. However, like it or not, this war was a wake-up call. So this is kind of my joke, Did you really think that Kim Kardashian was an Armenian? But now she is. She's provenly an Armenian. How much an Armenian I am, honestly. I don't speak the language, I'm from Russia. I teach at an American university, most of my career was, but I'm here, we're speaking about Armenian issues, so now I'm Armenian, you are Armenian. So it turns out that precisely because of this trauma and because we looked into the abyss, there are many more of us. There are people who are willing to help, including some non-Armenians, So I have offers from very important military experts, experts in the judiciary reform, economists, who are indicating that they're willing to come to Armenia just for food. A rather prominent Russian writer recently wrote to me, so responding.
Well, that's never an issue in Armenia.
Exactly. These people, but no, I'm half joking, but not just for food. They said, look, we don't need any money. We don't expect any money even for that. However, we need a testing ground for our theories. We actually know, in St. Petersburg, there is a laboratory of sociologists who study the post-Soviet judiciary. So we know what are the problems. We think we know how to fix them. We have no empirical case, where we could do this. The same with the military, who say that we actually think that we know what needs to be fixed, but Russia might be a very unresponsive, it's too big. Ukraine is a different country, so we are willing to come to Armenia. So we need to attract these people. And that's the biggest question, who are we here? And we need more of such public conversation to convince the people that first, the possibility is there. Second, that it's actually more doable than you thought. And third, it actually depends on how many people are listening to you and me. Right now, we are emerging. I never imagined this, how much do I know about military affairs or even about Armenian politics, but there are more and more people, who are willing to bring the expertise, to the public and to say that, again, it's very much like Levon Aranian or someone, Vardan Petrosyan in the old days. So here is the game which was almost lost. Or you think you lost it? Turn it around and let's see, are there still moves remaining? And this is where you need somebody at the grandmaster level. Because there are moves, they're probably not very evident, but if you point people's attention to this, and this is a game like any other game, very much like football. Armenia used to have great football. What happened to Armenian soccer? It's still possible, but very much, what happened to the state, what happened to the army, the same happened to the soccer.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I think you notice by living here is how much impact you can have compared to other places. It's immense because of the scale of the place. The small number of people, that old line about small number of dedicated people.
Dedicated.
Yes, small number of dedicated people focused on can totally transform this country, and it's entirely doable. One of the things which I think part of the angst that Armenians feel, especially I would say in the diaspora, is there's been the shattering of the psyche almost. This war almost has done more to people's heads than in other things. And that is, we had the first Karabakh war was seen as some kind of a renaissance from what we had suffered earlier in that century, is that we somewhat avenged that, even though it's a different circumstance psychologically, that our people were not refugees anymore, we were not running, we were not being driven off our land, we had victory, we were not being slaughtered. And you always hear this, because the psychological thing of this torture videos and all that is that. It's just, we're back to where we were, even though realistically we're not. Mm-hmm. How do you overcome this in the sense that you embrace it, but you go, okay, well, this is what it is, but we have to move on. How do you not let this shatter you?
First of all, the impression you describe, especially from the 1990s, was very misleading. Azerbaijan had a much bigger Armenian population than Karabakh. So what happened to the 400,000 Armenians outside of Karabakh, Azerbaijan? So all those Bakinci, to people from Kirovabad, right? So there was actually a nation of refugees. We turned away from that. Many people in Armenia and in diaspora. Where are they? And it's actually very important to recover them as fellow Armenians. The salvation actually was in the Soviet period. Once again, that this is part of the perestroika ideology and also part of diaspora ideology. They did not appreciate, just how tremendous was the success of Soviet Armenia in every sphere. That this was an incredible city. Just read the travel books by Western visitors from the 1960s, 1970s.
I have Michael Arlen, and you read other people.
Okay,
or the
we have
Russian
been speaking. Allow me a story, because we have been speaking for too long, about all the. So allow me a funny story. The year is 1986. I get a phone call from the Russian Novosti press agency, which is an KGB outfit. One of my former classmates worked there, and I attended a small, very elite college in Moscow, where I studied, I majored in African languages. So he calls me and says, do you still remember your Swahili? Because why? I said, we have 3 journalists, from Tanzania coming for a week to the Soviet Union. And so it's a program which is very standard, 2 days in Moscow, 3 days in one of the Soviet republics, 1 day, for the transfers. And I thought it would be a neat idea if we get them an interpreter and a guide, who speaks Swahili. So I get these 3 very different black Africans. One is very tall, very, very dark skinned, he's Maasai, if you know the Nilotic people. The other is stockier, much lighter skinned, typical Bantu, he's Chaga from the environs of Mount Kilimanjaro. And the third is from the island of Zanzibar, with a big nose, very Arabic. 3 total very different guys. And we fly, if I ask him, where do I take them? To Armenia. Okay. So we fly 1986, we fly to Yerevan. They look out of the, we land, and they look out of the window of the airplane, and there is this huge mountain, snow-capped, and they ask me, Nimili Magani, what is the mountain? It's Milima Yararati. So, like in the Holy Bible. So they descend on the steps from the airplane, they pull their pants, like the 2 of them at least, one is Muslim. But even the Muslim, so they kneel and kiss the ground. You should see the Armenians. So there are 3 holy land, and they start praying. So, okay, missionary types. And then there is the usual glory and the disaster of Armenian hospitality. They feed and feed and feed them, and then it's weekend. And the Armenian Union of Journalists doesn't know what to do with them, so they bring us to Lake Sevan. They give us a car, one of these, Soviet military style was horrible, but all-wheel drive, and the driver, and said, here is all the ishkan you can eat, stay. So the Africans very cautiously come to the lake, and they ask me, Kuna mamba mengi hapaziwari, are there many crocodiles? The crocodiles in Sevan, no, it's too cold. But then, okay, no crocodiles, it's too cold even for swimming. We had ishkan, we had the rainbow trout once, we had it twice. Oh my God, I still face, I'm facing, Saturday and Sunday. What am I going to do with them? And here, the driver comes and very, very politely says, there is a wedding in my village. It's not far, a couple hours from here. So we drive somewhere. It's a very ethnographic village, houses built of these big stones, women covering faces, but covering because they're baking lavash. It's very hot, so they're baking lavash in the. So I come in a car with 3 black Africans. People look at us. They push us inside the house. There are old men, only old men yet is sitting, and the feast hasn't started yet, sitting at the table. Cheese, lavash, a few bottles of local moonshine. So they look at this, son, where are they from? I say, they're from Africa. Are they Christian? I say, 2 are. Do they drink vodka? I say, I don't know. I say, offer. And then I don't remember, honestly. Because it was a Notsirani Ori. I remember that my Africans were dancing with someone. Then they were taken to everyone's home because my daughter is in the 7th grade in music school. You must listen how she plays piano. You haven't had coffee in my home yet. Oh, come, I just renovated the bathroom. You should see the ceiling I made. Something. A week later, I come to my senses in Moscow, and I get with a phone call from KGB, from state security of the Soviet Union. And very merry officer asked me, Derluguian, what were you doing to them in Armenia? I said, why? I said, well, your assignment was to turn them into friends of the Soviet Union, not into Armenian guerrillas. They came back to Tanzania and they wrote 8 articles in one day. Number 1 was the glory of Armenian civilization. Number 2 was why Western imperialist powers are hiding from the peoples of Africa the truth about genocide. And the final, when the people of Armenia calls, the peoples of Africa would come to the rescue. So this kind of story. So there was that Armenia. There was the Armenia of Burakan Observatory, and I remember, a great American historian, world historian, William McNeill, telling me, that, I've been to Armenia only once, and it was a very bizarre trip. It was to the conference on the contacts with extraterrestrial civilizations.
That was a famous conference.
Exactly. So,
yeah.
But it was great. So that greatness did exist. It actually, as a sociologist, I can tell you, that it was rooted in a relatively small network of world-class intellectuals who suddenly lived here. Do you realize, what kind of surprise it was for Westerners to come to Yerevan and discover that Martyros Saryan, who is part of the turn of the fin de siècle, turn of the 20th century artistic scene in Petersburg and in Paris, is actually alive, and he's continuing his experimentations with color, and he's quite comfortable, hospitable, he's somewhere there in Armenia. That there are the greatest world chess player, they are the astrophysicist. It doesn't take many, but they were here, and we have to recover that, and I think it's doable.
Yeah, it's like a zeitgeist of the moment, it's the zeitgeist of the spirit. Yeah. Well, Professor Derluguian, it was a pleasure having you. It was a long conversation, but I think it was an enlightening one. Thank you very much for joining us.
I hope that we're doing it and we're making a difference.
I think we are. This is your host of CivilNet, Eric Hacopian, and thank you for joining us.